The ceiling fell on me while I was eating lunch. Not metaphorically, not in the way people say their world collapsed. 40 kilograms of composite paneling detached from the structural frame of waystation Prowl's maintenance corridor and dropped onto the table where I was sitting, eating a vacuum-sealed ration pack I'd been looking forward to for 3 hours. The impact drove my forehead into the table edge. I felt the skin split above my left eyebrow. Warm, immediate. The kind of bleed that gets into your eyes and makes everything look like you're dying, even when you're not. I shoved the debris off, pressed my sleeve against the cut, and looked up through the gap in the ceiling. An energy discharge had sheared the bolts clean. Not metal fatigue, not vibration wear. The cut marks were symmetrical and precise. Someone above me had fired a directed energy tool into the mounting brackets. I had been on Waystation Prowl for 6 days. I was a pipeline thermal engineer on contract to the Rethani Mineral Consortium. I maintained heat exchange systems in deep space extraction rigs. I was not a diplomat. I was not a soldier. I was not a spy. My name is Travis Varro. I am 34 years old, and I fix pipes. That was the first attempt. I didn't recognize it as one. I thought it was a maintenance failure. I wiped the blood off my face with a napkin, applied 2 adhesive strips from my belt kit, finished my ration pack standing up, and filed a structural hazard report with the station's maintenance coordinator. The coordinator was a Rethani named Soleth Khan. He reviewed my report, blinked his lateral eyes in a way I'd learned to read as mild concern, and told me the section above my corridor was restricted to Ascendancy security personnel. No maintenance crews had been working there. I asked if that meant someone had fired into the ceiling deliberately. He looked at me for a long time. "I will investigate," he said. He was dead 11 hours later. Heart failure, the station medical officer reported. Soleth Khan was 41 standard years old and had passed his physical evaluation 16 days prior. That was the second thing I didn't recognize. Let me back up. Waystation Prowl was a mid-transit refueling and maintenance hub in the outer territorial ring of the Rethani Ascendancy. Roughly 800 beings lived and worked there at any given time. Mostly Rethani. A handful of Bravari traders, few Korvath freight operators, and me, the only human on the station. I was there because humans were cheap thermals contractors, and because the Rethani Mineral Consortium had 67 extraction platforms running heat exchangers designed by a human firm. I'd been rotating through their stations for 2 years. Prowl was my 9th assignment. I was supposed to be there for 30 days, recalibrate the exchanger manifolds on 3 rigs docked at the station, and move on. I was good at my job. I was quiet. I ate alone. I ran diagnostics, replaced gaskets, filed reports, and went to sleep. Nobody had any reason to want me dead. I learned later, much later, that the reason had nothing to do with me specifically. It had to do with a diplomatic crisis I didn't know existed, a territorial claim I'd never heard of, and a calculation by someone in the Ascendancy's strategic directorate that the disappearance of one human contractor, properly staged, could be used to support a narrative that human workers in Ascendancy space were unsafe, unreliable, and ultimately a pretext for closing border access before a treaty renewal. I was supposed to die in an accident, quiet, regrettable, administratively convenient. The ceiling was supposed to kill me. It didn't, so they had to try again. The second attempt came 9 hours after the first. I was asleep in my quarters, a pressurized module on the lower ring, one of the smallest berths on the station. I woke up because the air tasted wrong, not thin, Not warm, wrong. A chemical taste like scorched copper at the back of my throat. I'd spent 2 years working in deep space extraction rigs. I'd breathed every bad atmosphere a failing heat exchanger can produce. My lungs knew what contaminated air felt like before my brain caught up. I rolled out of my bunk, dropped to the floor where the air was denser, and crawled to the emergency atmo panel next to my door. The readout showed nominal, every parameter green. But my throat was burning and my vision was starting to swim. I popped the panel, pulled the manual bypass, and vented my quarters to the corridor supply. The air cleared in 90 seconds. I lay on the floor breathing, staring at the ceiling, and running the math. The atmospheric readout had shown green. That meant either the sensors were malfunctioning or someone had recalibrated them to read contaminated air as clean. I am not a genius. I am not a tactical thinker. But I fix systems for a living, and when a system reads green while the air is trying to kill you, you don't file a report. You start paying attention. I pulled the sensor housing off the wall. The calibration chip had been replaced. The new chip was clean, recent, professionally installed. Someone with maintenance-level access had swapped it within the last 24 hours. I put my tools down. I sat on the floor of my quarters, and I thought, someone is trying to kill me. It was the loneliest sentence I have ever formed. I did what any sane person would do. I went to the station's administrative office and requested emergency communication access to the nearest human consulate. The administrator, a senior Rethani named Dravan Oss, told me that the communication array was undergoing scheduled maintenance and would be available in 72 hours. I asked if there was an alternative method of contacting human authorities. He said no. I asked if I could send a message through a commercial carrier. He said the next commercial ship wasn't due for 11 days. I asked if I could file a formal security complaint. He stared at me with those flat, silver-ringed eyes and said, "About what, specifically?" I told him about the ceiling, about the air, about the sensor chip. He listened. He made notes. He told me he would look into it. I walked out of that office knowing I was alone, not suspecting, knowing. The way you know a pipe is about to fail, not because the gauge tells you, but because the metal sounds different when you tap it. The whole station sounded different now. The way people moved around me in the corridors. The way conversation stopped when I entered the commissary. The way Dravanos looked at me like I was a line item on a spreadsheet he was preparing to close. I went back to my quarters, locked the door, and made an inventory of everything I had. 1 toolkit, standard thermal engineering loadout, 2 pipe wrenches, a soldering array, sealant compounds, diagnostic leads, a cutting torch rated for composite and light alloy, 14 ration packs, 3 liters of water, my personal tablet, which was firewalled from the station's network, a photograph of my brother Ethan's boys pinned above my bunk, and the clothes I was wearing. No weapons, no armor, no comms, no allies. I had been in hard places before. When I was 22, a heat exchanger blew on a rig called Cold Break 9, and I spent 40 hours in a depressurized compartment. Breathing from a suit tank I refilled by cannibalizing a backup scrubber. I survived because I was stubborn and because I knew my tools. I looked at my toolkit. I started with the door. The third attempt was elegant. I'll give them that. The gravity plating in the corridor outside my quarters reversed polarity at 0300 station time. If I'd been walking through it, I would have been slammed into the ceiling at roughly 4 times standard gravity, enough to break bones, enough to kill if it caught your neck at the wrong angle. I wasn't in the corridor. I was in my quarters, behind a door I'd welded shut from the inside using my cutting torch. I'd rerouted my air supply to pull directly from the station's main trunk line, a connection I'd made through the wall into a service conduit I could monitor myself. I'd bypassed my room's atmospheric sensors entirely and jury-rigged a chemical alarm from a diagnostic lead and a sealant compound that changes color on contact with common industrial toxins. I heard the gravity reversal through the wall, the sound of everything unsecured in the corridor hitting the ceiling, then the sound of it all falling back down when the plating reset. I sat on my bunk. My hands were shaking. I want to be honest about that. People tell these stories later, and they make themselves sound steady, controlled, like they were already the person the story would need them to be. I was not. I was terrified. My hands shook. My stomach was hollow. I had not slept in 30 hours, and every sound the station made, every vibration through the hull, every pressure change in the air system hit my nervous system like a live wire. But fear is a funny thing when it goes on long enough. At some point, and I couldn't tell you exactly when, it stopped being fear and became something else, something hotter, something that sat lower in my chest and didn't shake. I was angry, not the useful kind, not yet, just the raw, formless kind, the kind that comes from being hunted in a place you came to work. From knowing that multiple someones had decided your life was an acceptable cost, and that they were annoyed it was taking this long. The anger didn't replace the fear. It grew up beside it. They coexisted. They fed each other. And somewhere in the middle of day 3, sitting on my bunk with welding burns on my fingers and a chemical alarm hanging from my air vent, I made a decision. I was not going to die on this station. Not because I had a plan, not because I had hope, because I was angry, and the anger was mine, and they had given it to me by trying to take everything else, and I was going to keep it burning until I ran out of body to burn it in. They cut my water. The supply line I'd tapped into went dry at midday. I checked the junction. The valve upstream had been manually closed. Someone had traced my bypass and shut it down. I had 3 liters, at minimum hydration, in the controlled temperature of my quarters. That gave me roughly 2 days. After that, I'd have to leave the room. That was the play. Force me into the corridors where they could control the environment. I sat with this for an hour. Then I pulled up the station schematic on my tablet. I downloaded it during my first day on board. Standard practice for any thermal engineer who needs to trace pipe runs, and started looking for water. Waystation Prahl had a closed-loop water recycling system. The main tanks were deep in the station's core, inaccessible without security clearance. But the heat exchangers I'd been contracted to service used a water glycol coolant mixture. The exchangers were mounted on the docked rigs, not the station proper, and the access corridors to the docking berths ran through sections of the station that were structurally separate from the main ring. I couldn't go through the station, but I could go around it. The maintenance crawlspace behind my quarters connected to a service conduit that ran along the station's outer hull. It was unheated, unpressurized in some sections, and not designed for human transit. But it connected to the docking berth where Rig 14 was moored, and Rig 14 had 200 liters of water glycol in its exchanger loop. I could separate the water from the glycol using the rig's own distillation system. I designed the separation protocol myself, 3 assignments ago. I cut through my back wall at 0200. The crawl space was tight 1/2 meter clearance in most places, less where conduit bundles crossed the path. The unpressurized sections required me to move fast, holding my breath, working from memory because my tablet light would have been visible through the hull's inspection ports. It took me 4 hours to reach Rig 14's exchanger bay. The rig was cold, powered down. I brought it up on manual, ran the distillation, filled every container I had. 3 liters became 12. I also took 6 emergency ration bars from the rig's survival locker and a whole patch kit that included a small canister of pressurized sealant. On my way back through the crawlspace, I found the first camera. It was small, aftermarket, mounted inside a conduit junction where it could see the full length of the passage. It wasn't station hardware. Someone had placed it there recently. They were watching me. They knew about the crawlspace. I stared at the camera for a long time. Then I reached up and turned it so it faced the wall. That was not tactical. That was anger. Pure, inefficient, satisfying anger. And for the first time in 4 days, I smiled. They sent someone. I heard the footsteps in the corridor outside my quarters at 0400. Then the sound of a plasma cutter activating against my welded door. Professional, steady, not rushed. I had 11 minutes before they'd be through. I'd timed the cutting speed of a standard plasma cutter against the composite I'd reinforced the door with. 11 minutes. I went out through the back wall, into the crawlspace, and moved. I am not going to pretend this was a plan. It was running. I was a pipe fitter running through the guts of a space station with a tool bag and 12 liters of reclaimed coolant water. And the people trying to kill me had finally decided to stop being subtle about it. But I'd spent 4 days studying the station's schematic. I knew the conduit layout better than anyone on board. It was my job to know it. I knew which sections were pressurized and which weren't. I knew where the inspection ports were. I knew which crawl spaces dead-ended and which connected to the next section. I knew the thermal profile of every pipe run, which meant I knew which sections were actively monitored and which were cold and forgotten. I found a dead zone. Section 7-K, lower hull, between the waste processing plant and the backup power coupling. An old maintenance bay that had been sealed during a refit 6 years ago. The station's records listed it as depressurized, but the thermal data said otherwise. There was heat bleed from the adjacent waste processor, which meant the seals were intact and the atmosphere was being passively maintained. I cut through the access panel, crawled in, and sealed it behind me. The bay was 3 meters by 4, dark, warm enough from the waste processor bleed. One emergency lighting strip still functional, giving everything a dull amber glow. There was an old workbench bolted to the wall, a defunct tool locker, and this mattered more than anything, a freshwater condensation line from the waste processor's cooling jacket dripping at a rate of roughly 1 liter every 6 hours. I had found a place they didn't know about, with water they couldn't cut off, in a section they'd forgotten existed. I set up the chemical alarm on the air vent. I laid my tools out on the workbench. I drank half a liter of water and ate a ration bar. Then I slept. Really slept. For the first time in 5 days. I woke up angry, not scared, not resigned. Angry. The kind of anger that clarifies, that sits behind your eyes and makes the world sharper instead of blurrier. The kind that says, you have been running, you have been hiding, you have been doing what they expected you to do. Stop. I sat on the workbench in Section 7K and thought about who was trying to kill me. Not their names. I didn't know their names. But their profile. Someone with access to station maintenance systems. Someone who could swap atmospheric sensor chips. Someone who could control gravity plating. Someone who could send an armed operative to cut through a welded door at 4 in the morning. Someone who could shut down the communication array and control the schedule of commercial ships. This wasn't a single person. This was the station's administration, possibly the entire security apparatus. and they were operating under direction from someone above station level, because a thermal engineer on a 30-day contract isn't worth this kind of coordinated effort unless someone with authority decided he needs to disappear. I didn't know what I'd been caught in the middle of. I still didn't. But I knew one thing with mechanical certainty. The longer I survived, the worse their problem got. Every day I stayed alive was a day their operation remained incomplete, a day the timeline slipped, a day the questions multiplied. Where is the human contractor? Why hasn't his death been reported? Why are resources being diverted to an internal operation that should have been a simple accident? I was not a threat. I was a delay. And in systems, in any system, mechanical or political, delay compounds. Delay has weight. Delay has cost. Every day I stayed alive, I got more expensive. So I stopped running, and I started making myself as expensive as possible. The first thing I did was access the station's thermal monitoring network. I'd been locked out of the station's main systems, but the thermal monitoring was a separate network, industrial, not administrative. It ran on a different protocol, and I had full contractor credentials because it was literally my job to use it. From Section 7K, I tapped into a diagnostic port on the waste processor's monitoring relay and connected my tablet. The thermal network came up clean. I couldn't send messages through it. It wasn't designed for communications, but I could see the thermal profile of every system on the station. Every system, including the ones they didn't want me to see. I could see the power signature of the communication array. It was not undergoing maintenance. It was fully operational. It had been transmitting continuously for 4 days. I could see the thermal bloom of a ship docked at berth 7, the berth that was listed as empty on the public schedule. The ship's drive core was idling. Someone was keeping it ready for immediate departure. I could see the heat signatures of personnel moving through the station, not individuals, but clusters. And I could see that a group of 4 had been stationed in the corridor outside my original quarters for the past 18 hours, waiting. They were guarding an empty room. They didn't know I'd moved. That bought me time, and I used it. I am a thermal engineer. I will say it again because it matters. I do not fight. I do not strategize in any military sense. I understand heat. I understand pressure. I understand the flow of energy through closed systems and what happens when that flow is disrupted. On day 7, I disrupted the flow. I accessed the thermal monitoring network and identified the 3 primary heat exchanger nodes that regulated atmospheric temperature across the station's habitable sections. These were the systems I'd been contracted to service. I knew their specifications down to the gasket tolerances. I knew their failure modes. I knew exactly which parameters to adjust to create a cascade. I didn't break anything. I want to be clear about that. I shifted calibration values, tiny adjustments within the range that would read as drift, not sabotage. But I shifted them in a specific sequence that would cause the exchangers to compete with each other instead of cooperating. Node 1 would overcool. Node 2 would compensate by overheating. Node 3 would oscillate between both states trying to balance the system. The result, over approximately 12 hours, would be a station-wide atmospheric temperature fluctuation of 15 degrees in either direction. Not dangerous, not lethal, but deeply, persistently uncomfortable. Every person on the station would know something was wrong with the environmental systems. Every person would be asking questions, and the only qualified technician on board to fix it was the human contractor, who had apparently disappeared. They couldn't fix it without me, and they couldn't produce me without explaining where I'd gone. Delay, cost, questions. The second thing I did was harder. The ship at berth 7, The one that wasn't supposed to be there was connected to the station's refueling system. I traced the fuel line from the berth back through the station's plumbing to the main fuel reservoir. The line ran through Section 9, 40 meters from my position in 7K. I crawled to the junction. I found the valve, and I closed it. Not all the way, 90%. Enough to reduce fuel flow to a trickle. Enough that the ship's tanks would take 36 hours to fill instead of 4. Enough that whoever was planning to leave in a hurry would find they couldn't. Then I crawled back to 7K, ate a ration bar, drank my water, and waited. The temperature fluctuations hit peak at midday on day 8. I watched it happen through the thermal network. Sections of the station swinging between 19 and 34 degrees, condensation forming on cold surfaces, heating elements cycling at maximum, the atmospheric processors working overtime, chewing through power reserves, and on the station's internal communication channel, which I couldn't access directly, but which generated heat signatures in the relay nodes that I could read as traffic volume, a massive spike in communications. Everyone was talking. Everyone wanted to know what was happening, and somewhere in the noise, someone slipped. The communication array, the one that was supposedly down for maintenance, transmitted a burst signal on a frequency I recognized. I recognized it because I'd seen it in the technical specifications of the Rithani Mineral Consortium's emergency contact protocol. It was the frequency used to contact corporate headquarters in situations that exceeded local administrative authority. Someone on the station had broken operational security and called for help. Not to help me, almost certainly to explain why the simple disappearance of one human contractor had turned into a week-long operational nightmare that was now affecting station systems and drawing attention. I didn't know who'd made the call. I didn't know what they'd said, but I knew it changed the calculation. Because now it wasn't just the people on this station who knew something was wrong. Someone off-station knew too. The delay was spreading. Then the worst moment came. At 1900, the temperature in Section 7K dropped 14 degrees in 30 seconds. Not the gradual fluctuation I'd engineered. A targeted, deliberate cool-down. Someone had traced the heat bleed from the waste processor and reversed the flow. They'd found my section. Not me, they couldn't see me through the hull, but they knew someone was drawing heat from 7K. And they were taking it away. The temperature dropped to 3 degrees, then to 0. I could see my breath. I had no heating element, no insulation beyond my work coveralls. My water would freeze within hours. My fingers were already stiffening. This was the moment, if I'm being honest, and I said I would be that I almost broke. Not from the cold, from the exhaustion of it. 8 days. 8 days of being hunted in a metal box in empty space by people who controlled everything. The air, the water, the gravity, the temperature, the communications, the doors, the schedules, the records. 8 days of surviving on reclaimed coolant water and ration bars in a forgotten maintenance bay, using a pipe wrench and a cutting torch to stay one step ahead of an apparatus that could simply decide to vent my section to vacuum and be done with it. I sat on the workbench and watched my hands shake from cold this time, not fear, and I asked myself the question I'd been avoiding. Why? Why was I fighting this hard? I had no one waiting for me. Ethan had his family. My parents were gone. I had no partner, no children, no one whose life would collapse if mine ended. I was a thermal engineer. I fixed pipes. The galaxy would not notice my absence. I looked at the photograph of Ethan's boys, and the answer was simple, not noble, not grand, not cinematic. I was angry. I was angry because they had decided I was nothing, a line item, a budget entry to be closed, and I had spent my whole life being small and quiet and invisible. And I had accepted it, and I had been fine with it. And now they were trying to use that invisibility to make me disappear for real. And something inside me, something I did not know, I had refused. Not because my life was extraordinary, because it was mine. I picked up my cutting torch. I cut into the wall behind the waste processor junction. I found the flow reversal valve they'd tripped remotely, and I broke it, physically, shattered the actuator with my pipe wrench so it couldn't be triggered again. Then I rerouted the heat bleed through a secondary conduit that didn't have a remote valve. The temperature climbed back to 18 degrees within an hour. I sat back down. I ate my second to last ration bar. I was so tired that the anger was the only thing with a pulse. That was enough. On the morning of day 9, I decided to end it. Not my life, the situation. I had been surviving, hiding, disrupting, making myself expensive. But I was running out of food, running low on water, and my body was failing 8 days of stress, minimal sleep, minimal nutrition, and the cumulative physiological cost of sustained adrenaline had left me shaky, slow, and making mistakes. I'd nearly dropped my cutting torch into the waste processor vent the night before. My hands wouldn't close properly. The cut above my eye, the one from the ceiling 9 days ago, a lifetime ago, had reopened and was weeping fluid that wasn't entirely blood. I was not going to last another 9 days, but I didn't need to, because I had spent 8 days inside the station's thermal network, and I had seen everything. I knew the communication array was active. I knew about the hidden ship. I knew the patterns of personnel movement. I knew which sections were being monitored and which weren't. And I knew something else, something I'd pieced together from the thermal traffic patterns over the past 48 hours. The burst signal to consortium headquarters had triggered a response. A ship was inbound. Not the next commercial carrier in 11 days, something faster, something unscheduled. Its drive signature had appeared at the edge of the station's long-range thermal sensors 6 hours ago. Estimated arrival, 14 hours. Someone was coming. I didn't know if they were coming for me or for the people trying to kill me, but someone with authority was coming, and that meant the window was closing for everyone. The station administration would know this too. They'd be watching their own sensors. They had 14 hours to finish what they'd started, clean the evidence, and present a coherent story to whoever arrived. 14 hours to kill me and make it look like an accident. I was not going to spend those 14 hours hiding. I used the thermal network one last time. I mapped every personnel cluster on the station. I identified the 4 operatives still staking out my original quarters. I tracked the movement of what I believed was the station's security chief. A thermal signature that moved between the administrative section and the communication array at regular intervals. And I identified the one thing I needed, the communication array's physical terminal. It was in Section 2, upper ring, 300 meters from my position. Through 6 pressure doors, 2 monitored corridors, and past the main commissary. I couldn't sneak through that, not in my condition, not in 14 hours. But I didn't need to sneak. I needed the station to be looking somewhere else. At 0900 station time, I accessed the thermal network and initiated a cascading shutdown of all 3 heat exchanger nodes simultaneously. Not a subtle calibration drift this time. A full emergency shutdown. Every node going offline within 60 seconds of each other. The effect was immediate. Without the exchangers, the station's atmospheric temperature would begin dropping within minutes. Within 2 hours, it would be below habitable thresholds. Within 4, the station's atmosphere would begin precipitating moisture faster than the processors could handle. This was an existential emergency, not a discomfort, a genuine threat to every person aboard. and the only person who could restart the exchangers was me. I crawled out of Section 7K into the service conduit, up through a maintenance shaft I'd identified 3 days earlier, and I emerged into the main corridor of the upper ring, in full view of anyone who cared to look, carrying my toolkit and walking toward the communication array like I had somewhere to be. The corridors were chaos, people running, emergency alerts cycling, the temperature already dropping, every Raythani on the station dealing with the crisis I had created. Nobody looked at me. That's the thing about being invisible. They'd spent 9 days trying to kill me because I was beneath notice, a background process to be terminated. And now, in the middle of a station-wide emergency, I was exactly what I'd always been, a maintenance worker in coveralls, carrying a tool bag, walking through a corridor, the most invisible thing in the galaxy. I reached the communication terminal at 09:14. The door was locked, security coded. I cut through it in 40 seconds with my torch. The lock wasn't designed to resist cutting tools. It was designed to resist unauthorized digital access. Nobody had anticipated that the unauthorized access would come from a man with a pipe wrench and a plasma cutter who was too tired and angry to bother with codes. The terminal was active, fully operational, just as the thermal data had shown. I sat down. My hands were shaking so badly, it took me 3 attempts to enter the emergency frequency. I transmitted on the Terran Consular Emergency Band, a frequency every human installation monitors, a frequency the Raythani couldn't block without actively jamming it, which would be an act of war. The message was 17 words. This is Travis Varro, human contractor, waystation prowl. 9 days targeted killing. Request immediate extraction. Evidence preserved. I transmitted it 4 times. Then I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. I was done. Not safe, not rescued, but done running, done hiding, done being the quiet maintenance worker who didn't make trouble. I had made trouble. I had made so much trouble that a space station was currently freezing because of me, and a fuel line was strangled because of me, and a corporate investigation was inbound because of me, and now a consular emergency signal was broadcasting across open space because of me. I was not a diplomat, not a soldier, not a spy. I was a thermal engineer who had spent 9 days turning the only skills he had, understanding heat, pressure, and flow, into the most inconvenient survival in the history of Raythani administrative planning. They found me in the communication room. 3 Raythani security officers. They came through the door 18 minutes after my transmission. They were armed. I was sitting in a chair holding a pipe wrench with my eyes closed. The lead officer, I learned later, his name was Tavrin Gol, pointed a sidearm at my chest and told me to stand. I opened my eyes. I looked at him, and I said, "The exchanger restart codes are in my head. If I don't enter them in the next 90 minutes, the station's atmospheric temperature drops below the threshold for Raythani metabolic function. Your species goes hypothermic before mine does. We both know this." He stared at me. "So you can shoot me," I said, "and freeze. Or you can let me restart the exchangers, and we can wait together for whatever's coming." He didn't lower the weapon, but he didn't fire either. I stood up. I walked past him. I walked to heat exchanger node 1, restarted it manually, and began the cascade restart of nodes 2 and 3. The temperature stabilized within 40 minutes. By then, 2 things had happened. First, the inbound vessel, a Raythani consortium oversight ship, had received my emergency transmission, relayed it to the nearest Terran consular office, and altered course to arrive under joint authority. The cover story was dead. Whatever narrative the station administration had been planning to construct around my accidental death was now forensically irrelevant. Second, and I did not know this at the time, my 4 transmissions on the Terran emergency band had been picked up by a human freighter called the Callaway Ridge, operating 3 systems away. The Callaway Ridge's captain, a man named Robert Hale, had no authority, no weapons, and no mandate to intervene in Ascendancy internal affairs. He came anyway. Burned hard for Prowl at maximum thrust, broadcasting my distress signal on repeat to every ship, station, and listening post in the sector. By the time the consortium ship arrived, 14 vessels from 6 species knew that a human contractor on waystation Prowl had been broadcasting a targeted killing alert for 9 days. The quiet disappearance that was supposed to support a border-closing narrative had become the single most visible human interest event in the sector. The investigation took 3 months. I gave testimony 4 times. The details are public record now, so I won't repeat them here. Dravan Oss, the station administrator, was removed. Tavrin Gol, the security chief, was arrested. 14 station personnel were implicated. The Ascendancy's Strategic Directorate denied involvement, but the consortium's forensic audit traced the order to an office 3 levels above station authority. 2 senior officials resigned. The border treaty was renewed, not because of me, but because my survival had made the argument for closing it politically radioactive. I was asked to testify at the consortium's hearing on Rethal. I agreed. I flew to their capital, sat in a chamber designed for beings a third larger than me, and told them what I told you. I fixed pipes. Someone tried to kill me. I got angry. I stayed alive. The consortium's adjudicator, an ancient Rethani named Valorn Drace, asked me a question at the end of my testimony. He asked me what I believed the strategic significance of my survival was, what I thought it demonstrated about human capability. I told him I didn't think it demonstrated anything about human capability. He tilted his head. I said, "I'm a pipe fitter. I'm not strong, I'm not fast, I'm not special." I survived because I understood the system I was trapped in, because it was my job to understand that system, and because I was too angry to stop. That's not capability, that's just refusal. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "In our language, there is no distinction between those 2 things." I went back to work 3 months after the hearing. Different station, different contract, same tools, same ration packs, same small quarters with a bunk and a locker, and a photograph of Ethan's boys pinned above it. People knew my name now. For a while, I was the human who survived Prowl. Contractors would nod at me in corridors. A Brevari trader bought me a drink once without saying a word. A Korvath dockworker told me I had, in his words, an unreasonable quality. I didn't know what to do with any of it. Here's the truth. The anger didn't go away. People asked me if I felt vindicated, if I felt proud, if I felt relieved, if I felt safe, now that the people responsible had been held accountable. I felt angry. I woke up angry. I went to work angry. I ran my diagnostics and replaced my gaskets and filed my reports with the same anger, sitting in my chest like a second heartbeat. Not at the Rethani, not at the Ascendancy, not at any specific person or institution, just angry. At the thing that had happened, at the 9 days, at the ceiling that fell on me while I was eating lunch, at the fact that I had been selected to die because I was small and quiet and no one would notice. I went to a human counselor on Meridian Station. His name was David Grant. He asked me what the anger felt like. I told him it felt like a pilot light, low and constant and always burning, not hot enough to interfere with my work, not cool enough to ignore. He asked me what I thought would make it go away. I said nothing. I said I'd spent 9 days turning anger into the only fuel I had, and now I didn't know how to run on anything else. I said the anger had saved my life, and I owed it everything, and I also hated it, and I didn't know how to hold both of those things at the same time. He looked at me and said something I think about every day. He said, the anger was the right tool for the situation. The fact that it's still in your hand doesn't mean you're broken. It means you haven't found the next situation that needs a different tool. He said, you're a man who knows tools. You'll recognize it when it comes. I'm still waiting. That's the honest end of this. Not a resolution, not a lesson, not a transformation. I'm still a thermal engineer. I still fix pipes. I still eat alone. I still wake up with the pilot light burning in my chest, low and constant. And I still go to work, and I still do my job. And I still look at the photograph of Ethan's boys, and I still don't know what to make of the fact that the thing that kept me alive is the thing that won't let me rest. But I'm alive. I'm alive because I was angry, and the anger was mine, and no one who tried to take it could. Waystation Prowl is still operational. They replaced the ceiling panel in the maintenance corridor. They recalibrated the atmospheric sensors. They fixed the fuel line to berth 7. They wrote new security protocols and filed new compliance reports and moved on. I check the thermal readings sometimes, out of habit. Pull up the network, look at the numbers, make sure everything reads true. Not because I think someone's coming for me again, because I know what it looks like when a system lies about what it's carrying, and I refuse to stop reading the gauges. The cut above my eye healed into a scar, thin, white, slightly raised. It pulls when I frown, which is most of the time. Ethan saw it over video relay last month. He asked what happened. I told him a ceiling panel fell on me. He laughed. I almost did. That's as close as I've gotten. Transcript recovered from the Rathani Mineral Consortium Administrative Hearing, Case 4471-PRAL, filed under Varro, Travis J. Contractor testimony, status, authenticated, classification, public.